Hello, everyone. Welcome to my new episode of Digitalization of Utilities. Today's topic is on the future of distributed flexibility. Flexibility is becoming increasingly important in energy sector as we move towards a net zero carbon future. Flexibility is all about balancing the supply and demand of energy in a way that is efficient, cost effective, and sustainable. This involves shifting the time of energy consumption or production or storing energy for later use. So, in today's podcast, we are going to discuss the future of distributed flexibility in the UK and how we can unlock the potential of achieving low carbon energy system. Our guest today is Sarra Börsig, who is expert in the field of distributed flexibility, and she has been working on the technical appendix for the future of distributed flexibility. Sarra, I'm thrilled to have you on my show. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm thrilled too.
So, Sarra, let's start with a basic understanding for our audience. What exactly is the distributed flexibility in energy system and why is it important now?
Yes. So, you started to mention it before. Flexibility means I shift energy in time and or location. And there's three things that are particularly beautiful and that make flexibility special, right? The first of them is everyone who's in our industry knows the energy trilemma, that you always have to optimize against cost, sustainability, and security of supply. And usually any market decision you take will help you with one, but then you're probably going to have cost on, one or two of the others. Flexibility is not like that. If you bring more flexibility into the market, you increase sustainability because you lower your CO2 emissions or all other emissions. You decrease the cost because you probably need NES or later network reinforcements, and you also bring down the cost. So it's a win-win-win. It's the most beautiful thing anyone could ever design, I think. And so that's one of the reasons why flexibility is so beautiful and so special and why we need it so much at times like this, right? Mm-hmm. There's also another element, the second thing that I think makes flexibility quite special, which is that in the old world, or for most markets, the energy market is very much focused on large assets. Flexibility, just like your renewables, really help democratize our energy market because you can absolutely bring in small scale assets into flexibilities like EVs or heat pumps or, buildings, etc. And that's definitely something very special and something that is beneficial in times like these where we know that we have peaks, we have, problems with gas supply potentially, we have a climate crisis coming up. So, plenty of reasons to move our electricity system into a more sustainable, more cost-effective, and at the same time secure place. And the third thing, which, we cannot not discuss when the two of us are in a podcast, is it really pushes the digitalization agenda. Because I think if you want to have flexibility at scale, the only way you can do that is by automating it. You need the price signals to come in an automated way, and you need the assets to react in an automated way. And the only way you can do that is by digitalization, right? You need digital infrastructures for that. And so, yeah, it's the most beautiful thing ever, if you want, right? It's just a win all over the place, and it's just what we need right now, I think.
Can you give me one example of what exactly distributed flexibility is? You mentioned EV, you mentioned heat pumps, right? So
yes, I'll give you an example. So I said flexibility means I shift energy in time and or location. So for EVs, for example, what you could do is let's talk about one EV first. For one EV, you could understand how it usually charges. So, most people will come home from work at 6, 7, sometime around that in the PM. And then they will, on most work days, not use their car until the next morning, 7, 8 a.m. And then, anywhere in that time they want it to be charged. And flexibility means we charge it at the point where electricity is at the lowest price because it's most available, as opposed to the moment I put it into the socket, I think is the name in English, right?
Yep.
So that's, and obviously if you do that with one EV, it's not very impactful. But if you do it with 10,000 EVs or 100,000 EVs, that's when you really make a difference and you help to balance the network in a way that avoids peaks and therefore enables us to use less gas, because gas is usually what we use when we want to serve at peak time, and therefore reduce emissions.
That's a nice example. So can you brief us on the work that you have done on the future of distributed flexibility?
Yeah, of course. So what I just told you, right, that I think flexibility is great. That was the premise of the work we just did. Basically, often our client agreed with the premise that they want to see more flexibility because it serves the energy trilemma so well. And they had 5 strategic goals that they wanted to achieve to increase liquidity in flexibility markets. They wanted to increase cross-market participation and coordination of the assets. So that means if you have an asset in one market, you should not be limited to that one market. You should be able to use that asset in more markets. What markets am I talking about? Ancillary service markets, the wholesale market, intraday markets, any markets really. Yeah. They wanted to simplify the market access. They wanted to increase transparency of the market data on assets, on products, on everything really, more transparency in those markets. They wanted to increase the trust in the market ecosystem around flexibility, and trust on both sides, right? Trusts for the system operators that the assets will actually be available, but also trust in the aggregator or FSP side that these markets will be there in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years' time, that it's worth them investing in understanding the pre-qualification, the regulation. It's hard work to get into these markets at the moment. And then they also wanted to increase the financial viability. And they thought, okay, these are our 5 strategic goals. Let's do that. Let's implement them with a system-wide flexibility exchange. And we were then brought in to look at what should this system-wide flexibility exchange do to meet these goals, and how could it look, right? What would be the basic design architecture for this to work?
So you said system-wide flexibility, isn't it? So Is it a common digital energy infrastructure that is mentioned in the paper? Can you elaborate more on that? What exactly is common digital energy infrastructure? And the specific word you mentioned was on system-wide flexibility.
I mean, it is whatever we make it, right? It was a very open project in the sense of this is the goal. The 5 goals I just described, or easier words, how do we get more flexibility into the markets? And the task was, what could do this? And we basically came up with use cases to meet the goals. So we suggested 3 archetypes, which I'm sure we can talk about later in more detail, but it was really about bringing in different use cases that would meet the goals to a different extent. So things like, do we need a centralized asset register? Do we need a centralized product register? Do we need centralized pre-qualification processes? Do we need reporting on prices, on volumes, on trades, dispatch, settlement, all of these things? And it's basically about finding out, okay, where are the actual pain points in the UK flexibility markets? What are the problems we need to fix? And then identify use cases that fix these problems as good as possible. And that's what we try to do on this project, right? To link these 2 things. We effectively ended up doing, I think, 24 interviews with a varied group of stakeholders, from DSO, TSO, aggregator, retailer, supplier, market regulator, government's body. I don't think there was any group that we completely missed. We really had a very good widespread of stakeholders. And we asked all of them a set of questions around, what are your key pain points? What is stopping you from bringing more flexibility into the market?
Okay.
And we use that to then really say, okay, this is the problems we need to solve to bring more flexibility into the UK market.
In your interviews and in your discussion with the key stakeholders, what sort of challenges do you see are being faced for distributed flexibility in UK?
Well, we really saw a lot. I think it starts with simple things like very disparate market processes and data standards, and very high barriers for entry for new participants. Things like every market having its own rules, every market having its own regulation. You need to pre-qualify almost for every market on its own. The baselining standards are inconsistent. The metering standards are inconsistent. That's like one big batch of problems that, is not that easy to fix. And a lot of people are trying, right? It's not for the lack of trying. But then there's another element of it, which is there's definitely a focus, just because that's where we come from as a market or as an industry. It's not a level playing field at the moment for small scale assets, right? Most products and services are designed for large scale assets. And also the complexity is in a way only like small scale assets or FSPs, aggregators, they can't handle the complexity that, a big retailer or utility, they have a whole team to analyze the markets and find out everything, right? If I'm a new aggregator joining the market, I don't have a team for every single market that I want to be in to understand all the regulation. So it's really about making things easier and making markets more accessible for the democratization that we want to see, both with renewables coming in and with flexibility becoming bigger and bigger, I think. And then there's other things like DNO market maturity, the lack of transparency, revenue stacking, but, just to name a few.
Yeah, and you mentioned a key example around how can we empower small players or small aggregators. The example that you gave around electric vehicles, someone with electric vehicle, how can they participate in the flexibility market and provide the required flexibility? It's very difficult at this point of time for an individual to play in that market. The focus is how we involve everyone into a flexibility market so that everyone plays a key role in minimizing the carbon emissions and reducing the load on the heavy generators, and also to increase flexibility because of dependency on renewables. So how do you think that this common digital energy framework could help us address the market failures that are currently hindering the distributed flexibility?
Well, it will depend on the use cases that are chosen for the final digital infrastructure that is created, right? And if you bring in something like the thin option, where you basically just allow for people to search each other, then the impact that you have is very little. People have an easier way of finding each other. If you bring in more functionality into such a digital infrastructure around reporting and data availability, then it's going to help with transparency. If you bring in more centralized processes, then it's going to help simplify and reduce market barriers. So it's not easy for me to say. And I think the way we designed our technical appendix to the Ofgem work was intentionally leaving the question open, because the call for input is very much there for people to tell us, what is your opinion? Which functionality should such a digital infrastructure have? And what are the problems you think can be solved with the use cases that we proposed?
Okay. So previously you talked about the three archetypes for a common digital energy infrastructure: thin, medium, and thick, as I read it from the paper. Which one do you think would be the most effective way, and why?
Well, I think just from a cost perspective, the medium SFE archetype makes most sense, because you don't replace functionality that you already have and that is working, but you bring in real net new functionality. So, just from a pricing, value for money, I think you say in English, the medium archetype makes by far the most sense. But I've already, with some of the inputs that I've seen towards the call for input, was that some of the elements that are currently already existing might make sense to include, right? So it's not these three options and there's nothing left and right. These are just three potential solutions, but you can absolutely pick some functionality from the thick option and bring it into the middle one, like auctions and or settlement, if we think that centralizing those is a real benefit. But that's not really for me, I think, to judge, right? That's for the call for input to find out what the majority of the industry stakeholders agree to.
One thing that we missed is what exactly those three archetypes are. Can you give a brief recap on what thin, medium, and thick archetype really means?
Yes. Okay. So in the technical appendix that we created, like I said, we looked at the pain points, then we created use cases, and then we effectively grouped the use cases into three design options.
Okay.
The first one was just one very simple use case, which is a simplified search for market participants. That's the thin design option. Then we have a medium design option, which only looks at net new functionality. So things like reporting on prices, volumes, trades, dispatch, settlement, but also things like the centralized product register or the availability to understand the eligibility for pre-qualification for certain markets or to understand the value of your assets. So multiple use cases, functionalities effectively that don't exist in the market at the moment were bundled into a medium archetype to coexist and strongly integrate with the existing systems and infrastructure around dispatch, settlement. All of that already exists, right? The system operators already hold auctions and they do dispatch and they do settlement. So the medium option says, that's all great, that's all working. Continue doing that. We'll add net new functionality to help with the liquidity and the transparency across flexibility markets. And then there was a third option, which was the final extreme, if you want, which says everything goes through this new centralized piece of digital infrastructure, including things like auctions, dispatch, settlement, and it's basically all just one big brain intelligence, bringing all the data together and orchestrating our system in the perfect way, right? And I think the archetypes are all set out as extremes so that you can discuss them, but the reality is obviously they're not extremes. You could bring use cases from the thick option into the medium option and therefore make it a bit thicker if it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So what methodology did you use to come up with these three options? One of the options that you discussed was interviewing. Is there any other way that you bridge all the gap together to come to these conclusions?
So in general, we use the typical IBM Garage methodology, which is an agile product-centric framework, which really helps you create customer-focused solutions, right? And what that meant in reality for us was we looked at the strategic goals, we identified industry pain points through interviews. We then used the outputs of these interviews to create use cases. And we translated these use cases into a value framework where we effectively looked for all use cases that we developed how much benefit do they bring, how much of the strategic goals do they meet, but at the same time, how hard is it to implement them, especially from an IT perspective, right? How complicated is it to develop such a functionality and, how much time would it take, etc. Yeah. So we really did a value framework, and that then fed into the design principles which we developed, where we looked at, so what design principles would such a digital infrastructure have to meet? If you want to know more about them, go talk to our architect, because I'm not the architect, right? He then developed the archetypes based on the data that he got from us. So we developed the use cases for him. We developed the value framework. He used all of that to create the archetypes. He came up with functional options. Functional options basically mean, you can do either functionality A or functionality B. He also came up with architectural options. Architectural options means this is the function, and there's two ways of implementing it which have an effect, but they all come up with the same functional outcome. And finally, we looked at business capabilities that would have to be met by whoever runs this digital infrastructure. What we absolutely did not do is say, this is who should run it or own it, right? That's a very political conversation to have. And it's not our choice. It's not for us to say.
What was the duration for this stakeholder meetings and then engagement?
It was a very, very intense 3 months, I think. Yeah, it felt like a lifetime. But it was a lot of work. It was a lot of late nights and weekends, but a good time. It was much fun.
It's always fun to have conversations with key stakeholders from market and understanding the problem statements, especially when it comes to digitalization and flexibility. How many use cases did you managed to write in those 3 months using Garage methodology?
You know what? I would have to lie to give you the exact number. It was probably around a little less than 40, I think, plus minus 5, something like that. A lot.
Yeah.
But to be fair, we didn't describe them all at the same level of detail. So for some of them, we went into real depth because we knew they were like focus areas. And then others like settlement, dispatch, auctions, we didn't properly write them out, as use cases with all levels of detail because everyone knows what auctions mean, right? So that we wrote 40, but with, somewhere just long and somewhere shorter.
That's nice. Okay. This is a very complex topic if you see from the problem-solving perspective. But on the conceptual side, the benefits that flexibility has are tremendous, isn't it? So if I ask you on that similar line, what would the digitalization of utilities would mean to you? How would you define it, considering this flexibility as a background?
Well, I think we are moving into times where it's getting more and more complex. If you look at the amount of assets, from something less than 100 assets that a control room had to manage to over 10,000 soonish. If you look at renewables coming in, being decentralized, being fluctuating, if you look at things like flexibility that make it much harder in a way because it make it not harder, they make it easier, but they also make it more complicated, right? They add another variable into your optimization to consider. There's no way any control room can handle this complexity with manual processes and Excel. It's not possible. Even now it's not possible, and it's getting harder and harder every minute. So digitalization of the energy industry is a necessity. But because you asked what it is to me personally, it's something insanely personal to me, right? It's what I've built my entire career on. It's what I enjoy doing. It's what excites me because I find it something that has incredible purpose. And I think everyone in our industry at the moment can really say we're doing something that matters, right? We're moving the needle towards, will we avoid a climate crisis? Will we make this world livable? Will we? And I feel like everything I do, all the projects I've done in the last, 20 years now, but 10 where I've really focused on this, they really matter.
Yeah, certainly. Energy sector sits at the heart of net zero transition. And unless and until we don't move or we don't achieve our net zero targets, other industries are dependent on us and they won't be able to achieve it. And this is a very beautiful industry that we are in. And the work that especially you are doing on the flexibility side is amazing. And I can understand the level of complexity that goes in just to create those use cases or to understand the problem statement and trying to solve those problems is tremendous, because it's not, as I said, it's not just 100 units that we used to have in our traditional markets. It's now thousands and millions of units, and it starts with our vehicle outside, parked in our garage, to a large nuclear plant, and everything and anything that sits between those things needs to be managed correctly to achieve this net zero targets. And flexibility is required to reduce the amount of investments that we put. Large generation, we can manage the demand using the smaller units that we have very efficiently, and that's where your work really plays a critical role. And I'm really happy that we can talk on this particular topic on my channel, and it's a pleasure to have this discussion with you.
Thank you, Ninad. It was really exciting.
Thank you very much for your time. It's really wonderful.